but actually the number one area of the brain. Every once in a while you get there and you're like, yes, suppress the dopamine response a little bit. And so I have some friends who've done very well in the entrepreneurial space, and some of them, you get the phone call, what do I do now? It's like, oh, poor you, someone's like, what do you do? And I always just say, give it away. What you want to understand is that the brain and nervous system are connected, and sure, an experience could be associated with a body part. I happen to know people that have had their limbs blown off north of the knee. Do they not feel? Of course they have feelings about that experience, but they're every bit as cognitively connected as other people. People have all their limbs removed. So there is something special about the real estate in here.
As far as the brain from going 0 to 25, 25 plus, can you explain how that works as far as neuroplasticity, and then after 25, how it works for people as well?
Yeah. So some of your audience may already know this, but neuroplasticity is this incredible feature of the brain's ability to change in response to experience. And we should probably broaden that definition to say the nervous system, because the brain is obviously amazing, but that's just the part of the nervous system that's housed in the skull. You've also got all these connections with the organs of the body that control breathing and heart rate. Those can change too. When you hear about things like muscle memory, actually muscle has no memory. It's the nerve connections that change when you learn something and you relearn it. So neuroplasticity.
Would that be connected with fascia at all?
Yeah, so fascia can, they receive fascia, which is stuff wrapping the muscles really tight. They receive some neural innervation. The fascia kind of talks to the nerves, not so much the other way around. But I'm sure now that I said that, someone out there is gonna, correct me. But and they're probably right. Most things in the body are bidirectional. So like the heart is communicating to the brain how fast it's beating. The brain is also controlling heart rate. The lungs are communicating with the brain are communicating with the lungs. So the reason I am hesitant to say it's all one direction is that typically when one looks a little bit more closely, you see that it's a two-way conversation. So anytime we talk about neuroplasticity, we're talking about the nervous system changing in some way to make the nervous system function better or worse. So a head injury will give you neuroplasticity, but it's called maladaptive plasticity. It doesn't make you better. So typically when we talk about plasticity, we're talking about adaptive plasticity, some change in the nervous system that allows you to be better, think better, perform better, any of that. That means something changed. And you asked about the 0 to 25 versus 25 and older. It's a pretty well accepted principle of neuroscience that the nervous system changes very easily from the time we're born until about age 25. It's not like on your 25th birthday, you get the gift of no more plasticity. It tapers off. And for some people it'll be 27 and some people will be 24. But from birth until 25, the entire nervous system, because of the chemicals that are circulating, because of a number of things, it just wants to change. And so it changes through just passive experience. So a child goes to their first movie or watches their first movie, and it changes the way they view the world forever. And you can unlearn things. That's also neuroplasticity. But all you need to do as a young person is be exposed to something and it will change your brain, provided it's novel or it's interesting enough or it makes you alert enough, you'll change. Now, after age 25, you can still get neuroplasticity, but the mechanisms completely change. The chemicals that are involved completely change. The ways to get neuroplasticity shift, and there are a couple requirements. The first one is that it has to be self-directed. We love the idea that we tell people to change and they're going to change, but the only change that comes after age 25 is self-directed change. You can shape a child for better or for worse. You can literally shape their brain and their nervous system. I mean, I would just watch the Tiger Woods documentary. He was shaped as a child to become the best golfer, and he obviously contributed to that. But you can't take an adult and make them the best golfer in the world unless they want to be the best golfer in the world. So there's a little bit of a contractual thing with the nervous system.
Is there a reason why that happens? Like, so is it just because children are more malleable? Is it because what's the actual reason for that?
Yeah, great question. So when you're born until about age 25, the connections between neurons, we call those synapses. And it's a little bit of a tricky name because we talk about as connections, but they're actually spaces between the neurons. They're like these little gaps, and the neurons spit chemicals back and forth across those gaps. Those synapses are the communication points between neurons. And anytime you learn something or unlearn something, anytime you acquire new language or motor skill, the arrangement of those connections changes. It's like new roads through a city kind of thing. So when you turn roughly 25, there's a significant change in the amount of space between neurons, and they literally don't have as much space to move around. It's called extracellular space. And it's not like cement gets poured in there.
Right.
But there are a bunch of things. If for the aficionados, these are like glycoproteins, and they have all these fancy names, perineuronal nets and that kind of thing. If people want to learn more, they can look that up. But you fill in that space, and it literally makes it harder to move things around. So the brain early on it has some things that can't change, like the areas that control heart rate or breathing. You don't want those to change because you want your heart rate functioning in the background all the time. But it's a little bit more like a Lego set. You can move things around a particular foundation. Now, after age 25, it's more like you've got the model glued together, and you can, steam away some glue and move things around, but it takes work.
Right.
And the work consists of focus. It requires intense focus. So a child, you can just put them in front of an experience or put them in an experience and it'll shape their brain. But as an older person, meaning 25 or older, you have to really concentrate on what it is exactly you're trying to change.
Yeah.
And this again is referring to adaptive plasticity, because again, a head injury will change your brain, but for the worse. So today, if I'm talking about plasticity from here on, unless we say otherwise, we're talking about adaptive plasticity. Okay. So there's less space for things to move around. You need focus. And there's also this interesting thing that you need focus, and then you also need deep rest afterwards, because that's actually when the changes occur, the resculpting of the brain. And the focus is key, because the focus on what you're trying to learn causes the release of particular chemicals. We can talk about those if you like. Yeah. And those chemicals send a signal to the brain, something needs to change. And if you think about it, there's no reason for your nervous system to change at all. Why should it? And these chemicals that make us feel alert or surprised or anxious or afraid or very, very excited, those aren't just for our emotional experience. Yeah. Those mark time in the brain and say, wait, something's different now than it was a few minutes before this happened. Right. And now there's this opportunity to learn. And then the brain starts looking around for, well, what should I learn? Right. And we could talk about what the steps are for changing, but it's really a chemical and an actual physical difference in the brain between 0 to 25 and after 25 that underlies this shift in what we call passive plasticity early in life. You just passively go through life, and for better or for worse, by 25, your brain is going to be the way it is. And then you can still change it, but you have to dig in and put some effort.
Right, which is important, because most people think, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I just am the way that I am. And so I guess it makes sense in the sense that, if 100,000 years ago, you and I are walking by and you decide you want to go get water from a lake and alligator takes you, that's going to be a very heightened state. There's going to be a lot of focus that's going to come to that. It's going to tell me next time I go near something like this, I need to be more careful. So it seems like it can be an evolutionary trait to make sure that people, for safety, I guess, long-term. But is the chemical that you're talking about acetylcholine that's released from the brain when immediately we need to focus on something?
Yeah, so acetylcholine is one chemical in the cocktail of chemicals that allow the brain to change as an adult. The example you gave of the alligator or the crocodile grabbing your hiking partner and pulling them away, it's a really good one. Actually, if that happened, a couple of things would be clear. If something really bad happens, you get what's called one trial learning. You will never forget that happened. And for some people, they think, oh my goodness, I've had these traumas. How will I ever forget? You can unlearn the emotional relationship to it, but you will never forget. It's kind of remarkable. Yeah. It's kind of the stinger of biology, because you wish that you could have that for other things that were more pleasant. But not only would you not forget the alligator event, but you would remember all the things that led up to it, even though you weren't thinking about those as it happened. So that morning, you putting on your shoes in a particular way, the trajectory you took to get to that lake, all that suddenly would be called up to memory and packaged into this experience. And so this is, it gets to a lot of things related to trauma, where people will or PTSD, people will start to have all the physical symptoms of a trauma that have nothing to do with the actual traumatic experience. Yeah. And we always hear the kind of cliche example of, a car backfires and then the veteran who's come back thinks that they're in a battle. It's actually, that can happen, but more typically it's they get up in the morning, they're making up a cup of coffee, and bam, all of a sudden the emotions hit, the physical symptoms hit. And it probably relates to the fact that things that happened, actual traumas that happen, capture elements in time before, during, and afterward.
Oh, wow.
And so the nervous system wants safety. Fundamentally, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs starts in the nervous system. Everything's anchored first in the nervous system. And so you would capture that entire sequence of events. Now, for positive things, the negative events are triggered, the highlighting of negative events, I should say, is triggered by the release of epinephrine, which is adrenaline. So adrenaline comes from the kidneys in our body. That makes us breathe faster, makes us pupils dilate, all the physical symptoms of stress and anxiety. In the brain, we call that exact same molecule epinephrine, just to confuse people.
Yeah.
I didn't name them, so and
then there's norepinephrine. That's something that's not
norepinephrine,
the same thing,
which is similar but not quite the same. But we'll call it epinephrine or adrenaline interchangeably. So that causes alertness, and it has no bias towards positive events or negative events. So if you see somebody that you really enjoy seeing and you didn't expect to see them, epinephrine will be released into your body. As well, acetylcholine, which was the neuromodulator that you mentioned, is released, and acetylcholine acts like a spotlight. So as I mentioned, when we're excited by something and we're stressed, our pupils dilate, which actually causes us to go into a bit of a tunnel vision. We don't always experience it as dark around the edges kind of tunnel, but we don't see the big picture, literally. It changes the optics of our eyes. We get much better at seeing individual things. If you've ever been in love, you've experienced this because the person just seems to occupy your entire visual field and your entire emotional field, as it were. So there's this kind of soda straw view of the world. Not always bad. It can be good, as in falling in love or being excited about something. And acetylcholine is a molecule that's released in the brain that is marking or highlighting the specific areas of the brain that are active during a particular event. So one way to think about this is if you decided that it were important to you to, say, learn a particular language or to learn all there is to know about something that's very vital to your life for some reason, the information would literally be highlighted as you read it in your brain, and that would make it easier to learn. So, but the actual learning doesn't take place while you have that acetylcholine swimming around in your brain and highlighting things, or the epinephrine, the adrenaline. It happens later when you go to sleep. The reorganization of the brain happens in deep rest, sleep and things like it. And so this is why sometimes people will work very, very hard at trying to make a change, and it's just not happening. It's not happening. It's not happening. And then they'll take a little bit of a break, or a week later they come back and they nail it.
Yeah.
That is because the changes don't actually occur during the attempt to learn.
Yeah.
And maybe one other thing that I don't think I've ever really talked about terribly much on podcasts is that errors and making mistakes is key. And that's not just as thematically like, oh, errors are good. You learn from errors. What is the Michael Jordan thing? I missed whatever 10,000 of the shots I didn't take. I can never remember the quote. Anyway, making errors is good, but at a neurobiological level, plasticity is faster when you make errors. And here's why. When you do everything properly, you get up from your chair, you go get a glass of water, you speak the languages you speak, why should your brain change?
Right.
It has the complete operating manual for what you need to do.
Right.
When you make a mistake, it feels terrible because you release epinephrine, and most people will tilt away from the experience at that point. They want to walk away. But if you can focus on what just happened and what you're trying to do, you bring acetylcholine to the learning experience. And when you make errors, there's something called top-down processing. It means that the higher order areas of your brain send signals deep into the brain. Whatever you're about to do next is really important. And so it's probably best thought of as throwing darts at a dartboard, because it's just so straightforward to use as an example. So if I throw a dart, misses the dartboard entirely, I've been that guy, by the way, at the bar in college, like really bad. I've not great binocular vision, which is ironic because I study vision. But so if I close one eye, I'm actually better. And I throw it, okay, so then I'm off from the bullseye, and I'm getting frustrated. It's like, and I want to walk away from it. But if I keep doing that, what's happening is my brain is queuing up all sorts of things without me realizing it, like what trajectory my arm is taking when it goes left, what trajectory my arm is taking when it goes right, why suddenly I think I'm doing everything right and it hits the wall again. And if I were to go away from that for a short while, or maybe continue to just throw errors, I'm learning faster than if I get closer on the first try.
Right.
So the brain takes error signals and says, okay, we need to correct this, and that's plasticity. So to make it really concrete, making errors isn't just good because we tell people it's good and you have to try, you have to fail in order to learn.
Right.
It's actually the best portal into learning.
Yeah.
Your brain will not change, your nervous system will not change unless you're making errors. And this is actually what kids do really well. The kid learning to walk is falling down all the time. And the brain is updating, okay, what was different? And a lot of it's subconscious. The kid isn't thinking, oh, I have to bend my left knee a little bit more. I need to, flex a stabilizer muscle in my tibialis. They don't think like that. The nervous system is very smart and it just figures it out. So focus, errors, and rest. Focus, errors, rest. Focus, errors, rest. And then pretty soon you have fluency in what you need to do.
Hey everybody, this podcast is sponsored by Athletic Greens. Let me tell you about how I start my day every day. I go to the bathroom, brush my teeth, drink Athletic Greens, and meditate. And in 30 seconds with Athletic Greens, in one scoop, I get 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food source ingredients. It has everything that a multivitamin would have, but it's also got greens, probiotics, prebiotics, digestive enzymes, immunity formula, adaptogens, and more. And I'll tell you this, it's so important to me for my mom to have a great immunity with all the stuff that's happening in the world right now that I bought Athletic Greens for her specifically from my own pocket because I wanted to keep her immunity up. So for you, make an investment in your health today and try the ultimate all-in-one bundle and support your immunity, your gut health, and your energy by visiting athleticgreens.com/dial. You'll receive a full year supply of liquid vitamin D for free with your first purchase. Again, that is athleticgreens.com/dial. 70% of people say they want to use natural products, but only 2% do. Why is that? Why? Because what they sell at the store is from the biggest companies, not necessarily the ones that are the best for you. So where do you start? Well, you start at the Grove Collaborative. Grove is an online marketplace that delivers healthy home, beauty, and personal care products directly to you. Grove Collaborative takes the guesswork out of what's going green. Browse the site for thousands of home, beauty, and personal care products, all guaranteed to be good for you, your family, your home, and the planet. And with Grove, you don't have to shop at multiple stores or search endlessly online for all of the natural goods that you want for you and your family. So join over 2 million households who have trusted Grove Collaborative to make their homes happier and healthier. Plus, you get shipping fast and free with your first order. So making a switch to going natural has never been easier. For a limited time, my listeners can go to grove.co/Rob, and you'll get a free gift with your first order of $30 or more. But you have to use a special code. That's grove.co/Rob to get your exclusive offer. That's grove.co/Rob.
So one of the most mind-blowing things that I've heard you say is when you talk about acetylcholine, first off, you say what you just said, where it feels stressful. So like I think back to where this really clicked for me. I heard you saying it at one point in time where acetylcholine comes from the stress part of the brain, right? And I've been at the point before, I've been playing guitar since I was 15. And it's easy for me to sit down and just play songs I've been playing forever. But then I sit down sometimes, I'm like, I really want to learn this Pink Floyd solo. And I can feel myself getting like, oh shit. Like I just want to go back to playing the easy stuff. And then I'll be like, just let me lay back. Let me go back to the easy stuff and forget about playing, forcing myself. But at that point, it's actually that it's marking my brain to start to change is what you're saying. And that's usually the point where people get to the wall and they're like, I'm not supposed to do this.
That's right. That's right. So one of the worst things that have happened are the movies where people suddenly have skills they didn't know they had. It does not exist. It doesn't. Now there's crossover, right? Athletes that are terrific in one domain can be terrific in another domain. But if maybe framing it this way, which you just did very nicely, will help people if they're trying to learn, which is when you feel agitation, that's the brain and nervous system queuing up the things it needs in order to create change. But you will not experience the feel-good molecules, dopamine and serotonin, until you hit a new landmark, until you hit a new milestone.
Yeah.
That does not happen. There's no feel-good entry into real learning. Now, that doesn't mean that learning has to feel terrible, but there's no positive reward from failure at the chemical level. Except there is one little twist, which basically is a chemical neurobiological explanation of growth mindset, which is my colleague at Stanford, Carol Dweck's, discovery, and obviously naming that's hers. But growth mindset is about the idea, of course, that you may not have a skill, but that you could. It's the idea, I can't yet.
Yeah.
But as well, it's also about adopting the mindset that the learning process, the friction process itself, can be rewarded subjectively. So what this means is that when you're trying something new and it's stressful and there's a lot of agitation, there's no natural reason why the nervous system should give you any dopamine release to feel good or serotonin release. But we're smart animals. We can subjectively say, wait, the effort process itself is what's going to get me where I want to go.
Yeah.
And in doing that, you can start to weave in some of this dopamine release. Now, we know that because dopamine and its release in the brain, which makes us feel good, tied to motivation, et cetera, is extremely subjective. And we know this because what's funny to you might not be what's funny to me.
Right.
What's important to you might not be what's important to me. There's probably some overlap there, but there's probably some difference too. And we've all experienced dopamine before. You're feeling absolutely miserable. Something's terrible. And then somebody cracks a joke.
Right.
If it's not funny, it tends to send you further down the trench.
Yeah.
If it is funny, you feel an actual lift and you feel like you have more energy to go on. And that is not a psychological thing as much as it is a chemical thing. Dopamine is an amazing molecule. People think of it as the molecule of pleasure, but it's mostly the molecule of motivation and drive. And dopamine is the precursor, literally the chemical precursor from which epinephrine and adrenaline are made. What this means is if you can subjectively tell yourself, I'm doing well, I'm excited, this is super frustrating, but I don't know, Huberman was blabbing that this is the entry point to learning, and failures are supposed to be good. If you can start to say, I kind of like this, what ends up happening is you actually have more chemical energy, neural energy, in concrete terms, to continue. Because what's rate limiting in terms of how long we can push is epinephrine. There are great studies that show that, not done by my lab, but other labs that show that the ability to persist and endure is dependent on a reservoir of epinephrine in the brain. It's not so much about adrenaline in the body, it's fuel. And dopamine is like a re-up on that fuel.
It's like a buffer for
I've heard you say. I know this sounds a little, whenever something's very concrete, like a breathing technique or a vision technique, it's you just list it out and it's very intuitive. With this subjective thing, what can help people is if they start to understand, the mind has really got its hardwired mechanisms. Like when something is stressful and I can't do something, it's going to feel not great. But if you can recognize that and you can start to incorporate the subjective part of learning, which is that is the first door to learning and the feel-good process that lies on the other side. And people who learn how to tap into this, I guess Tiger Woods would be another example. Clearly, I don't know him. I remember when he was at Stanford, but I don't know him. But it's clear in watching his trajectory over the years with golf is that hard work and focus and effort were inherent to his process. Right. And all great performers, whether or not it's in science or music or athletics or business, they learn to associate the hard work not just with the reward that's coming later,
for sure,
but it becomes its own form of reward.
The process is the reward.
And that can go off the rails and can become a problem. People become workaholics. I've been accused of that before. They're wrong, but no, I'm just kidding. But within healthy range, that's really, if there is a kind of a secret sauce or to the whole thing, it's the dopamine that you can control the release of. And so I always say with dopamine, you have to be very careful. This is also the molecule of addictions. This is the molecule of great self-destruction if you're not careful with it. But if you can learn to regulate it through hard work as well as celebrating rewards, then you essentially have open field on whatever it is that you want to learn. And you stand a far greater chance of succeeding. Because otherwise it's just going to be grind. Oh, I hope this works out. And then if it doesn't work out, you don't have the gas to continue. And if you really are about process and result, not just process and not just result, chemically you have all the machinery going to take you through 3 lifetimes of hard endeavors.
Yeah.
And fun endeavors for that matter.
Yeah. So if we're boiling it down, if we just go back to like the guitar example. So, I'm going to sit down and play some guitar, and I know the chemical cocktails are now going to happen inside of my brain. I know I'm going to probably hit a wall that's going to feel like I want to stop, and it's resistance. And that is, the point where my brain is starting to want to change. And instead of me going, okay, when I learn this entire Pink Floyd song, which could take me days, then I'm finally going to feel good about myself, which will finally give me the dopamine. It's like, if I can spend the next 2 minutes learning just these 3 parts, and then I get past those 2 minutes, and it's almost like a mini celebration inside my head, I can give myself dopamine, which then gives me more drive and motivation to continue to keep learning the rest of it, right?
Absolutely. So chunking, breaking things down into their elements, is something we hear about all the time. It's, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. How do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time.
Yeah.
This kind of thing. What's missing in those statements about chunking is that they never tell you to reward different elements of the process. And there's some other tricks you can use and that can accelerate this process. One is, let's say you decide, I don't play music, so I'm going to mess up the language around this, but I'm going to learn 1 chord or half a chord. Can you do half a chord? 1 chord. I'm showing my musical ignorance here. 1 chord or 1 bar of music, and you reward that. And you're like, yes, okay, that was really challenging. But if you understand that kind of the excitement that you feel at that point is the opportunity to continue. And we can talk about how this is rooted in ancient mechanisms, not mechanisms to allow us to learn music, but mechanisms that allow us to find mates and build shelters and build civilizations, all sorts of things. But if you can do that, but every once in a while, skip the reward. Every once in a while, you get there and you're like, yes, suppress the dopamine response a little bit. And the reason is, the best learning schedule is the one that the casinos leverage, which is intermittent reward. Mm-hmm. If your body and brain start to expect dopamine on a regular schedule, and that can be a regular schedule in time or a regular schedule like every time I get the A or every time I learn a bar of music, it will start to have a diminished effect over time. And so I have some friends who've done very well in the entrepreneurial space, and some of them, you get the phone call, what do I do now? It's like, oh, poor you, someone's like, what do you do? And I always just say, give it away. Just give it away. And if that feels good, great. Or give half away. And they're like, wait, what? And some of them do give it away, or much of it, never all of it, but much of it. So they're good people. But people who develop a relationship with dopamine that's attached to effort, pick a milestone, reward yourself subjectively. How do you know if you've done it correctly? There's always the question I get. How do I know if I've done it correctly? You'll know because you have energy to continue. Mm-hmm. And you'll have a kind of a pervasive feeling of satisfaction. Mm-hmm. But the idea is to push into the next vista, to the next milestone. Mm-hmm. Then every once in a while, just remove the reward. Remove the reward, because in doing that, your dopamine system, it's never really adapting to a particular schedule, because the next bar of music in this solo might be really hard, and you might not actually get it that day, but you need to be able to come back the next day and continue. Yeah. And so this is something that your mind can really shape itself. I mean, this is the most amazing thing about the brain as opposed to all other organs, or the nervous system compared to other organs, is that your liver can't say, oh, I want to change myself for the better. So we have, people argue about free will and all this stuff. I don't like arguments like that. They're silly arguments, frankly, for reasons we could get into. They don't have any direct biological underpinning that we can point to yet. But this stuff about dopamine for rewards and acetylcholine for focus and epinephrine for agitation, those are as true in your dog and my dog and every person in the world as it was 100 years ago. Right. And we always like to think about, 100 years ago, all these chemicals were there because we were being chased by saber-toothed tigers. No. People had breakups 100 years ago. People died dogs died 100 years ago. Terrible things happen and great things happen. These are mechanisms that were designed to be applied to any scenario, whether or not it's, Bitcoin or basketball or university work or whatever it is. And so the elements of the nervous system, the kind of ingredients to work with, are very basic. And once you understand them, you can start to rearrange them however you like. We all know the feeling of immense dopamine release, huge milestone, or big surprise. Someone sends you a check or something you didn't think that was going to happen that's positive happens. And just one thing I want to mention about dopamine that I don't think I've ever mentioned before is dopamine and its release is also how we fragment time. So there's these beautiful studies that have been done where they've had people watch sports games where people are very vested in their team winning, and they measure dopamine release in the brain. And every time there's dopamine release, it kind of resets the way that you focus on the world and your ability to extract more information. And this is, I think, why celebrations mark kind of time for us. Great things and bad things mark time, when someone died, when they got married, et cetera. So when you're playing with dopamine in these ways, what you're doing is you're taking control of a process that, if you don't take control of it, is going to be controlled by external events. When are they opening up businesses, right? How's the market doing? Is Bitcoin at 60 or 6K today? You are driven by external events. And so this has been discussed a little bit by Josh Waitzkin, the great chess player, turned Tai Chi hands, turned stand-up paddleboarding guys. Like, I don't know him, but one of these amazing people who wrote The Art of Learning. He talks about this in non-neurobiological terms, that the ability to stay in that plane of calm is key. The self-reward we sometimes think about as jumping up and down and be like, yes, I killed it, I did it, I succeeded, high fives all around. That's powerful, but equally, perhaps more powerful is, I just did that. And the internal sense that you just hit a milestone, and instead of wasting energy jumping all over the place, to move to the next milestone. And high performers do this very well. And they're also very good at just showing up and taking care of business. And so it doesn't matter what domain you're in, this stuff of dopamine giving you more gas to push on further, because it's the precursor to epinephrine. This is the stuff that once you start taking subtle control of, it becomes easier to know if you're tapping into it. So people shouldn't obsess too much about whether or not they're doing it right. The results of the learning process will tell you if you're doing it right. But it takes time. And it's a practice that you learn.
Yeah. It's funny because I think back to, I used to sell Cutco back, and they used to sell Cutco knives, and we used to make hundreds. I remember a
Cutco guy come to our house.
Yeah, I used to sell, I'd make.
They were good knives, actually.
They're great knives, yeah. And so that's how I got into learning about this stuff, was because then I started training people. I trained 2,000 people by the time I was 25. And when I would sit down to make phone calls, what I would do is I would take a bag of Skittles, and I'd make 100 phone calls. And so instead of saying, all right, I'm going to wait till I get to the very end and I get the entire bag, it'd be like, all right, when I get my first 10 done, I get 3. And I didn't know that this was a thing. I just remember hearing somebody say, it's good, just reward yourself after each one. But I've learned over time, almost unconsciously, I think. My videographer comes over and we'll record like 5 episodes in a day. And that's to sit down and focus, and 5 episodes in a day is hard. But she brought something up. She's like, do you realize that you celebrate yourself after every episode? And it's to the point where I'll like move the mic away and go, that was really fucking good. And that's all I'll say to her. But she's like, you notice that you celebrate yourself. And I heard you talk about how dopamine reward systems give you just that little bit more drive to do it. And I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. Why I get so excited to then go to the next one, even though mentally that could have been exhausting on the 3rd episode in a row.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great example. I mean, dopamine is the molecule of craving, of motivation, and possibility. And it has a dark side too. I mean, drugs that throw dopamine through the roof, like cocaine and amphetamine being the 2 most common ones that do that, they create a vicious loop where the drug-seeking behavior itself and the drug become the only source of high amplitude dopamine release. And so nothing else compares. And I define addiction as a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. We're not talking about that. We're talking about taking subjective control of dopamine. Dopamine and all the other feel-good molecules, not the bad opioids that people get addicted to, but the ones that you make yourself, endogenous opioids as they're called, dopamine, serotonin, those are all taken care of just fine by all the evolutionary basics, right? Food, warmth when you're cold, cool when you're too warm, sex and mating, all the stuff that we're hardwired to feel pleasure with. But those systems are also available for subjective control. And that's how we've been able to emerge as the dominant species on the planet, right? I mean, there's some other really smart animals, but we're the curators of the planet, right? We own the technology. We build the technology. And there's a reason, which is that we can attach dopamine and the reward system to anything. And because of the way it segments time, you're able to say, okay, I did an interview, I finished it, and I now have some reward or celebration, and now it gives me the energy to go another one and another one and another one. If you just batched it by hours, well then you would start to feel exhausted.
Yeah.
You would literally start to feel exhausted when you hit whatever mark that was.
Right.
Really, I don't like, to encourage gambling. I don't have I've said this several times, so people are going to start to wonder, I don't have a gambling addiction. I do, I find it fascinating to look at gambling because it's all about dopamine and schedules.
Right.
But people are attaching their schedule to the external environment. Really good professional poker players play for time.
For sure.
Because if they play for how they're doing, then it's a disaster.
Yeah.
So they know how to play well, they have skill, but they play for time. So there are cases where they actually reward themselves for being able to stop whether or not they're up or they're down at a given time unit, because otherwise you're going to be controlled by some external thing, like the person took your stack of chips 5 minutes ago and you're pissed. And that can happen to anybody. So they know themselves better than to attach their dopamine to something that they can't control. So in certain cases, you want to attach it to time. In some cases, this is the way teams can fight their way back from devastating, disparity in scores. You look at great comebacks are about attaching dopamine to just football is a really good example because you get the next first down, like first downs are dopamine, right? That's what allows you to push downfield. And then look at the team that wins and the team that loses. The team that wins, they fought hard. The team that loses in a really good game, the team that loses, they fought hard, and look at how much energy the team that won has.
For sure.
That's dopamine.
And so I've heard you say that, and this is super interesting when you talk about, especially at the end of the game, if we take that example where one team loses, one team wins, the team that wins, even though they probably as we take the Super Bowl, they put as much energy as they possibly could, both teams, which is a ton of adrenaline they're putting in, going through their body. But when the dopamine comes in, it actually buffers what I've heard you say, the adrenaline, which then allows them it brings it down a little bit. So it allows them to have more energy to keep going, which at the end they could have worked their ass off and have nothing left in the tank. But when they win, it's just like, oh my gosh, I've got all of this energy again.
Yep. And we hear a lot, sports nutrition is really important too. Nowadays, a lot of people are ketogenic, but you can work off glycogen from the liver and muscles. You can work off body fat stores. You can work off fuel, but neural fuel is what we see and what really makes us super impressed by, like the Steve Prefontaine videos. If people don't watch those, they should. If you don't like running, just watch a couple of those. Like you will go running. It's just, they're amazing because he understood neural energy. Right. And I'm sure he took care of his nutrition and everything else. But look at the examples, David Goggins, Steve Prefontaine, they're many, Rich Roll. Like there's so many examples in the endurance fields where people somehow intuitively understood that when we hear it's 90% mental, I say because I'm a neuroscientist, I say it's 100% neurobiological. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. This is not muscle glycogen that suddenly you get that reserve. People talk about flipping the switch. Oh, they somehow flip the switch. That's neural. Yeah. That's not glycogen stores. That wasn't your ketone suddenly got liberated into the bloodstream. All that stuff matters. But when you see truly impressive feats of athleticism, or you see people who have fought incredibly long bouts with cancer, or you see people who've come from absolute abject poverty and managed to get a university degree, that's dopamine, epinephrine, and all the other stuff we're talking about. Sports examples just provide a more immediate and concrete example that I think most people can, if not relate to, they can look to, and when they know what we're talking about. So that's why we're focusing on that. But it's just a core set of kind of macronutrients or ingredients in the nervous system that allow it to change. Yeah. And everyone has them. Some people do have, clinically low levels of these molecules and depression and things like that. But there's also this loop where behavior triggers the molecules. So this is why, and the molecules trigger behavior. So people with very low levels of dopamine or serotonin will experience depression, which unfortunately makes them less likely to get into action to do the things that increase dopamine and serotonin. Yeah. And so that's why I'm not of the stance that antidepressants and things like that are across the board bad. They can help people out of some very deep trenches. It's just that those aren't the only tools that people should rely on. And many people don't have clinically low levels of those molecules. They need to get into the specific types of action that will allow them to ramp up these levels. So these days you hear a lot about how antidepressants are so terrible, but antidepressants have saved a lot of lives. Yeah. But ultimately these chemicals were, when I say designed, I mean they evolved in the nervous system and body to reward certain behaviors and actions, and punish others. And we can take control of that process.
Yeah. Yeah. I read an article not too long ago that said that they think like 61% of depression is misdiagnosed. But I think what's important in what you're saying is that when people actually understand what's happening in their brain and they can understand why they feel the way that they feel, because there is this constant conversation between your head and between your brain and your body at all points in time. What you're saying is if somebody does happen to get onto depression medication, what I think is important for them to have knowledge like this to know, all right, now that I'm on this medication, how do I get myself out of this hole versus doing the exact same actions I've been doing that maybe got myself into this hole?
Absolutely. And for people that rely too much on supplementation or too much on nutrition, both of which I think are really important and I adopt for my own life, it can also be a problem. I have a friend who's a MD, a medical doctor. He has a great saying. He says, better living through chemistry still requires better living.
Yeah.
There's no pill, there's no device, there's nothing that's going to make you learn faster without a cost unless you're also doing the correct things. And I think that nowadays, unlike 10 years ago, I think there's pretty good general agreement about what the foundations of good mental and physical health are.
Yeah.
Get sunlight early in the day and in the afternoon. Avoid artificial light in the middle of the night. Whatever it is that, whether or not you're intermittent fasting, you're vegan or you're carnivore, it doesn't matter to me. Get on a nutrition regimen that allows you to be focused when you need to be focused and sleep when you need to sleep. Good social connection, exercise. I mean, breathing, and that we now, I think, is pretty well generally accepted, especially after 2020, that having a healthy respiratory system is good and can afford you some resilience and other things. I mean, it now almost sounds redundant, if someone's spending time on Instagram or they're paying attention to what people like you are doing or Jay Shetty is doing and some of the stuff we talk about on my podcast, then this stuff sounds redundant. But for many people, I think they're kind of wondering, where are the power tools? The real power is in establishing a really strong foundation. And the really strong foundation comes from practices that are geared toward making sure that the dopamine, epinephrine, and serotonin systems and acetylcholine systems, that they're there and ready and available for use. Because you only have to sleep deprive yourself for a few nights before all the stuff that we just talked about will not work.
Right.
You only have to eat poorly for 3 or 4 days in a row and spend too many nights out drinking when you will forget everything you learned and you will have a panic attack 3 weeks later. So there's this relationship between the high performance stuff, the really leveling up stuff, and the foundation. And I've been very fortunate to do some work with US and Canadian special operations. And one thing that's so impressive about people in special operations is that they spend a lot of time doing really high level, super sophisticated, highly trained stuff. It's super impressive. But they spend a lot of time for their entire career on fundamentals and just making sure that their nervous system is ready to do all that other stuff. And I think today there's been a little bit, we hear so much about becoming superhuman or people, these superpowers, or that people are underestimating the value of having a really strong foundation on the house. And this is why the work that, for instance, guys like Matt Walker have done, talking about why we sleep. I've never met Matt. We've met once actually, but I think, so just to be clear, we don't have any professional relationship, but I think what he did was so powerful because he really just said, look, the superpower lies in this thing that we should all be doing very regularly.
For sure.
And I think that you have to have the foundation set. And once the foundation is set, the rest becomes very straightforward. Now, if people are very depressed, sleep becomes a problem. Eating becomes either overeating or undereating becomes a problem. And so socializing becomes a problem. And so you can start to understand why some chemical support might help to get everything scooted back into place. But anyway, I'm kind of editorializing on this here, but I think that high performance is great when you've got all the basics. But the basics themselves, that foundation, can take you to exceedingly high levels of performance in all areas of life.
Yeah.
And that includes relationship and just living your life. I realize that not everyone's out there trying to, hit that next super high rung. A lot of people are, but a lot of people are, especially right now, coming off 2020, a lot of people are like, look, I just want to go from back of my heels to flat footed.
For sure.
The same principles apply.
So they can just celebrate feeling flat footed again. And so it's important because if you start thinking about this, then people say, okay, well, now I feel like they have a foundation of a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about and how to get that working. But one of the things that's super important in this is to get the acetylcholine and the adrenaline and everything, is that they have to have focus to be able to do that.
That's right.
So for someone that's out there and they want to figure out how to have more focus, one thing that I kind of accidentally just started doing this for a while, was when I need to really get something done, like to sit down and script out episodes takes a lot of mental energy for me, is I have a routine that I stick to. And it's, I put on my headphones, I play the exact same binaural beat song that's 3 hours long, and I get coffee, which I've heard caffeine helps in that. And I'll chug an entire cup of coffee or tea. I'll have my headphones on, I'll have the song on. And then since listening to you talk about it, I will literally stare at my screen and try to make my eyes as big as I possibly can and feel, which is really important now that I've realized, feel how the actual room starts to disappear on the outside of my eyes. You know, and literally just the computer is the thing that I see. And I can feel the actual chemical cocktail start to go, all right, now it's time to go.
Yeah, that's great. So caffeine increases at levels of epinephrine and dopamine to some extent, a little bit. It's inappropriate doses. It's great. You know, people are really caffeine sensitive. It can make them like, you know, feel like they can't sit down.
Too much.
And people vary a lot, you know, and, or if you're like me, I'm probably pretty caffeine sensitive, but I've just blitzed my receptors for so many years. So it's not a good thing to do, but these days I actually drink a lot less coffee. I drink mate or something that's a little bit more even.
Yeah. I love yerba mate.
What's that?
Actually, that's yerba mate has become my focus thing now.
It's great. I mean, I have Argentine lineage, so I'm biased there, but it's great because it has caffeine. It also has electrolytes and it has this thing called GLP-1, which can stave off hunger. And a little bit of hunger is actually good for focus because it ramps up adrenaline. And, you know, seeking food is one of the primordial ways in which our species learn to focus. Because if people have this idea, if I don't eat, I get lightheaded. That might be true if you have some blood sugar regulation issues. You need to eat eventually, but typically not eating is the way that our species went and found food. So it actually enhances focus. You know, they didn't just walk through the woods like firing arrows off in random directions and hope you hit an elk, right? So some level of underlying hunger actually can be good. Hydration's good too.
I usually skip lunch, and Dr. David Sinclair's on my podcast, and he usually skips lunch as well, is what he says. And I notice if I have the yerba mate, the headphones, all of that stuff on, and then I'll have dinner later on, it's like hyper focus for, and I've heard you talk about, for like 90 minutes. I can just go.
Yeah, David's great. I think the idea of skipping one meal a day really works. That's something I've done. I tend to skip the first meal of the day. It's a little easier for me. The visual focus part is really important. I'm glad you mentioned that, because our cognitive focus, our ability to focus and pay attention to one specific thing or two specific things, we can move between two, but to not be scattered and looking at our phone all the time and to do what Cal Newport would call deep work. I'm such a huge fan of his over many years now. So if people haven't seen that, I think that's an amazing book. But that ability comes from an ability, of course, to limit distractions, but the visual system is the dominant driver on mental focus. And, you know, these two little bits in the front of our face, those are two little pieces of brain. They're the only two pieces of our central nervous system that are outside the cranial vault. The rest is the spinal cord and brain. But our eyes, our neural retinas, are part of the brain, and they're out here in the front of our faces so that we can know when it's daytime and when it's nighttime, when to be alert and when to be asleep. They're also out here as opposed to someplace else so that we know what to focus on. And so if you're going to sit down and do work, there's great power in spending a few minutes at the beginning focusing visually on something, anything at the exact distance from that work that you're going to perform. Now, that doesn't mean YouTube or something, although, you know, I enjoy YouTube. I want to be really clear. I'm not one of these anti-social media people. I'd be a hypocrite if I said that, because I use it and I provide content there. But if you focus on like a little crosshatch or your blank screen or at a point on a wall at approximately the same distance, what you're doing is you're creating the tunnel. I actually have a little note. I've never said this to anybody. I hide it every time somebody comes over to my house, but I have a little sticky right above where I do my writing and my deep work, to steal the Cal Newport phrase of deep work. And it just says like, find the tunnel, get in the tunnel, stay in the tunnel. And when I I look back to that thing, and it's just about, I mean, because I like you, I've got email, people that need things from me. I've dropped the ball with people. There's anxiety about what I'm not doing, all those things, just to find my way into that tunnel for 90 minutes or so. Because these 90-minute learning cycles, these ultradian cycles, are pretty optimal. And I might spend 5 to 7 just absolutely aggravating minutes trying to find my way in. But you can, like you said, you can feel it click over. And at that point, a nuclear bomb could go off and I'm not going to stop doing what I'm doing. And I actually learned this when I was in graduate school because I used to cut brains on this thing called a microtome. It's like a deli slicer.
You used to cut brains though, you just said?
Yeah, I used to cut brains. Yeah, I do
just
still.
Casually
I still do a lot. Yeah, we record from human brains. I mean, we cut brains after, not from live people, sectioning brain tissue. And there's a rule. It's like the microtome is like a deli slicer, but you're cutting brains, and you take the little slice of brain, put it in a little dish, and you stain it, and you put it on your slide, take a picture, whatever it is you're interested in. It's actually very satisfying. And there's a rule which
you realize to the average person how crazy this sounds, right?
Yeah. Well, these brains came our way through ethical means.
Yes.
The moment that blade hits the brain, if you stop or move too quickly, you completely damage the tissue, and it's very valuable tissue. So you learn to just focus your eyes on this thing and just pull, and it's so satisfying to get into that zone. But before smartphones, it was much easier to do, but it was still challenging. And so the first couple slices on this thing were always subpar, but you come out of it and you feel amazing. And people should also it's not just because you're cutting brains. This would also be, typing or working of any kind. It also happens in conversation when it takes time to break in.
For sure.
And then you get in the tunnel. And when you leave that, as you said, you want to, after about 90 minutes or so, you want to reward yourself for it. Take a little break. People talk about the Pomodoro technique, which I think is like 20 minutes on.
25 on, 5 minutes off. Yeah.
So that could be great. I think you pack 2 or 3 of those into a 90-minute cycle. I find during the 5-minute thing, if I pick up social media, I'm gone.
Yep.
I'm in a different tunnel.
Yep.
And that tunnel, and hats off to them. I have to say,
they know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing. They know a lot of neuroscience. In fact, there's some folks there. I have not been advising them, but they know their neuroscience, because what you want in order to put yourself in the tunnel is a ton of novelty. And there's nothing as novel as a scroll. Australia, Europe, basketball, skateboarding, podcast. I mean, like what's on road, like all these things are coming through. They're in a fight. Oh my goodness. Comments. You're literally time traveling in this little tunnel. Of course it pulls you in. When you sit down to write your book or you sit down to do anything else, you're not going to get the level of novelty because you're literally digging a hole into something conceptually. And social media is throwing at you millions of concepts, which itself is not bad. Like I said, I really enjoy it, but you have to understand what your attentional mechanisms are up against. And I will say this, it's great to be a consumer. I love consuming content. I find the internet to be just I'm so happy I'm alive at the time in life, history when I am. There's so much great stuff out there that you can access now. But if you're going to be a consumer, terrific. But if you want to be a consumer and a creator, you're going to have to get really comfortable with the agitation and boredom that comes from your own deprived little universe of not created yet. But the twist in that is everyone is following the creators. The consumers are following the creators. So there's no way around this puzzle. So getting good at focus using your visual system, and it sounds like you use auditory as well. There's some people. I should finish that statement. Getting good at that, the visual system, using the auditory system, that's a power tool. So it's great you've done that. With auditory, if you're feeling really ramped up, sometimes too much sound around can, be distracting. If you're feeling tired, then you can use the auditory system to wake up your nervous system, because music or something, you can draw back focus, because we wake up from sleep because we hear a loud noise. So auditory cues are very big wake up signals for the brain.
I've also heard that you can kind of, I've always just put on the same song because it was just easy to put on the same song. But I've also heard that you can almost like, what is it, Pavlov's dogs, where you're training your brain to know that we're about to go into this. Like I listen to the exact same 5 songs in a row when I'm stretching to work out. I listen to the exact same song when I'm about to go in, different songs, but the exact same song when I'm about to go into work. So is there a sense of that? Is that true as well, where you can literally train your brain to know what it's supposed to do at the next moment?
Yeah, I think it's that when this used to occur more when people listen to entire albums. Now, because of playlists and the way that you can shuffle and the way that programs will self-select for you, or will select for you rather, it's not so common. But it used to be that if you listen to an album, you could anticipate the next song right as the previous one ended.
Yeah.
And if a different song came on, you'd be like, wait, so that's dopamine.
Yeah.
That's time segmenting with dopamine. That's like you're anticipating. Remember, it's about motivation, anticipation, and what's coming next. And so if you repeat the same song, that's good. What you're trying to do is get into a bit of a time warp. One thing that I think is really useful for people who are easily distracted is to really pinpoint what you're being distracted by. Is it the feeling that somebody needs you and you're not going to be available? A lot of people who are like real like caretaker types, they feel like, oh my goodness, if someone were to reach out and I'm not available, whatever.
Yeah.
Other people who they find they're cleaning the whole house when they have something important to do. That both those types of people, just by identifying that's what the issue is, then you can make it a bit of a game. I'll sometimes do this. I like a really clean workspace, but I don't always accomplish that. So I've actually recently, I'm like, I want to see how focused I can get amidst chaos. Now, I don't destroy my house or anything like that, but I just notice how the challenge of not like cleaning up the coffee stain on my desk or something is pulling me. But I know you're building a sort of resilience by pushing away from that and being able to refocus. And I learned this actually because several of my science colleagues are incredibly productive, incredibly smart, and their offices are incredibly dirty. And it was like, not dirty, but just messy. I was like, how do you work in this place? And I realized they have incredible powers of focus. They don't care that they're in a mountain of books. It's just they don't see it. And they don't see it because they choose to pay attention to something else. Yeah. So I've been playing this game with myself recently of not trying to have optimal conditions all the time. I think we overstate optimal. I think you talked to Rich Davini. It's really just defined this principle really well as it relates to all sorts of domains of performance. When we seek optimal, then the moment we sense 5% off from optimal, we can dissolve into a puddle of tears. Right. Sometimes it's good to train our mind in cognitive endeavors and sports endeavors, et cetera, emotional endeavors in suboptimal conditions, right? And you don't want to defeat yourself. You don't want to have the really hard, important conversation when you're 2 days sleep deprived. But you know what? Sometimes it's good to be able to have the hard conversation when you're exhausted because you get better at doing that sort of thing.
For sure. So for people who are out there and you probably get messages all the time because you have a big social media following. I get messages all the time of like, I can't focus. I don't know how to focus. So what's an easy plan for someone listening to all that we just said to go, all right, I need to sit down and need to crank out emails or whatever it is I need to do. How do I go from doing something around the house to, all right, I've got to get down and be super focused right now? Yeah.
So I can think of 3 ways. One is ritualize it, right? And you talked about that. So I'm a big believer in setting one 90-minute work block early in the day. Yeah. That's when I do my best highly focused work. I try not schedule anything around that. I accept there will be agitation. I accept that there will be noise outside. But I make that 90-minute segment holy. Nothing's going to get between me and that. And then I try and get another one in the afternoon where it's more creative type work, which tends to go, creative work is favored by slightly sleepier states where your mind isn't quite so rigid. So I try and do that. So one way is to ritualize it and set it for 90 minutes. I use the program Freedom, where it locks you out of everything on the internet.
Oh, nice. On a computer or phone?
On computer. I'm working mainly on the laptop. I think it also is for the phone. So Freedom's great. You tell yourself, but I have to look something up. You write it down. You look it up later. It's fine. I look up a lot of stuff. So it's there. The other one, so that's number one. Then that's what people really should establish on a regular basis if they're interested in creating anything. The other is deadlines. Those are great. A lot of people like myself will wait till a deadline hits. Yeah. Here comes the adrenaline. You're in the tunnel because now what you've done is you've created something that supersedes all other demands. And we have a social contract where we can say either my kid needs something or I have a deadline, right? Obviously the kid thing is more important. Yeah. But I don't have kids, so that excuse doesn't work for me. And I've never pretended to have them just so I could, get out of doing things. So having a deadline is great. That'll put you in the tunnel. Much more so actually than having a big incentive, right? Many people have shown that people are more willing to work for to avoid loss than to gain. So, but the one that falls in between is really the one that I think is overlooked often, which is not just ritualizing these work schedules and optimizing them, not just having deadlines where it's external, but where you deliberately create a situation that is, on the face of it, not consistent with optimal performance. So that means you're in the airport or you're ready to leave work, and provided that there's no one waiting for you, you sit down and you punch out 45 minutes worth of really good text because you know you can, but the problem with the optimal zone of 90 minutes, and you know what that's like, that's a lot like needing everything to be perfect in order to work out. Chances are over time, especially as you become more successful, you're not going to be able to optimize as many things. People don't realize this, but this is actually a tool that I incorporate. I have a good friend who was also in the SEAL team. His name Pat Dossett, and he'll sometimes say, like, "Can you run on Thursday at 4:30 a.m.?" And I'm like, "Oh my god, 4:30." I'm like, "I can," and I'm thinking that'll be a lot of fun. We've had some great swims and runs early in the morning. Those guys love early morning and cold water, so sure. I'm not going to run as well as I would at 10 a.m. because that's when I'm really, warmed up. But doing that actually has its own virtue because you're training your body to be responsive to your demands, your mental demands at any time. So you can create a nervous system that is primed for success in optimal conditions and in suboptimal conditions. I actually have experienced this in workouts too. I love working out late mid-morning, it's clear I'm warmest about 3 hours after waking up, after I have 2 cups of coffee and this and that. But then if you don't have that, then all other workouts feel like they're